Okay. Afternoon, everybody. I'm Robert Hammond. As he mentioned, I'm going to be giving you a little talk on why I think philosophy matters. During my icebreaker speech, I talked a little bit about my hobbies, probably the most important of which to me is my interest in philosophy. It's guided a lot of important decisions in my life, and I want to share that with you. So first, I'm going to start off with why this question even matters. Like, who cares about philosophy, right? After all, philosophy's been around. People have been philosophizing for over 2,000 years, 3,000, 4,000 years. Since the beginning of time, since man could first communicate and think, people have been philosophizing. Famous British philosopher named Alfred North Whitehead, back in the early 1900s, said, all philosophy is just a footnote to Plato. Plato was alive 2,500 years ago. That means essentially he's saying that no progress has occurred in philosophy for 2,500 years. So what's the point, right? Furthermore, beyond just not making any progress, if you've ever tried to read a real original work of philosophy like Kant, Hegel, Heidegger, or anything like that, I think you'll find that it's almost impossible to understand usually. It's no fault of your own to be the best, have the greatest reading comprehension in the world. But some of this stuff is just very, very poorly written. I'll provide you a real quick example. Take about 5 seconds and attempt to understand that. That's good enough, you're not going to get it. When I was in high school, I read a 400-page book of this. This exact book, Being in Time. None of it made any sense. It was all just that, over and over, 400 pages. That's what a lot of philosophy really is, just poor writing. And as a result, philosophy gets a really bad rap. People experience this, they experience the fact that the philosophers tend to talk about, does my right hand really exist or not? I think I look exactly like that too. And it just sounds pointless. And probably most importantly, kind of harkening back to what that philosopher said about philosophy being a footnote to Plato, philosophy doesn't bake bread, or so people say. What I mean by that is it doesn't produce any real tangible achievements, or so a lot of people think. But philosophy still occurs anyway. People still philosophize, they're still philosophers, and I guarantee each and every one of you, either internally or with a family member or friend, have had a very intimate discussion about what matters to you, what's important to your life, to you in your life, and what's valuable to you. And as a result, philosophy does still matter, because that's philosophy. So that's exactly where philosophy can succeed, where science fails. Science may bake bread, but science can't tell us what matters to us. Only philosophy can tell us that. Philosophy doesn't necessarily tell us the what, but helps us develop the why and the how. It helps us ask those questions and determine for ourselves. Everything else in life hinges upon that one decision, what matters to me. Whether I want to buy an iPhone 6 or an Android, whether I care about whether I'm pro-abortion or against abortion, all those decisions from the trite to significant hinge upon that one question, what our values are and what matters. But first I want to counter a silly argument that philosophy does not bake bread. It's pretty obvious that it does. Just look at science. All forms of science, from physics to psychology, ultimately were fields of philosophy at one point. Even physics, the most hardcore, certain scientific and mathematical of all different scientific disciplines. Harkening all the way back 2,500 years ago to Thales, an ancient Greek pre-Socratic philosopher who thought that all reality was based out of water, was structured out of water. It sounds a little silly to a modern mind nowadays, but this was an early human being's first attempt to grapple with this concept that reality could in fact be structured out of constituent parts. Very important movement, and all scientific thought kind of proceeded from that type of thinking. Now, unfortunately, I don't have as much time as I would like to really discuss this, because I can go on forever about this. So I'll leave you with one really important example, and this gets back to the what matters piece. Back in late 1800s, there's a philosopher named Friedrich Nietzsche. You may have heard of his name once or twice. Usually, unfortunately, he's been associated with a lot of bad stuff, like Nazism, fascism. In more recent history, his name has kind of been clear. But he had a lot of very important critical thoughts to modern day society. He once proclaimed, through a parable of a madman walking into town with a lantern, he walked in the middle of the town square and proclaimed, God is dead, and we killed him. Regardless of whether or not you're Christian, Jewish, atheist, agnostic, or somewhere in between, it doesn't really matter. This proclamation, while part of a bigger analysis on his part, had huge ramifications for all of society, Western society, and everybody else who was kind of touched by the same encroaching modernity. In modern society, with the rise of industry, technology, science, increasingly religion, regardless of whether or not we are religious, has become less of an important part of binding piece of our social fabric. And as a result, lots of people throughout the world have had a harder and harder time defining what matters for them. Because where in the past, religion would help us define that, nowadays we don't have that to the same extent. Even if we're religious, we look towards other things to help us define what matters to us. And that leads us, he thought, to a state of nihilism, where we would be essentially left in a vacuum to figure things out for ourselves. Now, we have various ways of figuring that out, and this might be a topic of a future lecture, or excuse me, not lecture. Speech, Professor Bean. But one really important way, one really common way that we try to fill that void is with things like clubs and with sports, most notably. Think about the 49ers, the Patriots. Who really cares if one team or the other wins or loses? Think about your home team. What does it matter? Your home NFL team. You think that most of that team is actually composed of people from your local community? But somehow we project upon these teams who have no connection to us some representation of our common shared values. It helps us build a sense of camaraderie within our community, and it helps fill a certain void that's left behind the lack of what in the past was religion, a sense of community. So with that, I'd encourage you to engage in a little philosophy, whether it's discussion, literature, or actually reading one of these kinds of works and trying to dig a little bit deeper and find out why for yourself. Thank you.